to another week of performance management. Um, I am excited about this week because it ties into another class that I teach, which is actually performance management. And I think you all will be taking it with me this coming fall. And I really love the content of that class and the opportunity to mix that kind of purely HR topic with DEI is really incredible. And I think shows the power of trying to combine things that you're learning to synthesize information across classes and to really dig deep in thinking about how DEI is relevant to and kind of permeates all of the different areas of HR and HR management. So, last week, we spent some time talking about recruitment and selection. So, how do we expand diversity in the individuals who come into our organization? And this week, we're going to look at the ways in which we evaluate employees and the ways in which we coach employees and rate employees, and how all of that has implications for our DEI strategy as well. So, to begin, we will start here with just a definition of performance management. So, performance management is the continuous process of identifying, measuring, and developing the performance of individuals and teams and aligning performance with the strategic goals of the organization. So, there's a lot to unpack here, and we'll actually do it on the next slide because oftentimes when we talk about performance and performance management, what people mostly think of is the idea of performance appraisal. And so this is when we measure and describe an employee's strengths and weaknesses. So typically that annual evaluation period that organizations tend to do, this is what comes to mind as performance appraisal. So performance appraisal tends to be a one-time evaluation. So again, usually annually. Is just a reporting of how someone did. It does not inherently contain any information about coaching or developing employees. And it tends to be very descriptive rather than prescriptive, meaning that the focus is on looking at a particular performance period and just describing or summarizing what someone did during that time. But it doesn't tell a lot about what needs to happen in the future or ways in which performance can be improved or strengthened over time. On the other hand, performance management is that continuous process, right, of setting goals, observing performance, talking about performance, and providing coaching and feedback. And this idea of performance management is that there's a direct link between employee performance and organizational goals. So we care about how employees are performing because we know that their performance is going to link back to what we have already set out as our strategic priorities for the organization for a given year. So it's not just checking a box and giving a rating, but really trying to ensure that our employees are doing well, that their performance is up to par, because that will trickle down to influence whether or not we achieve our organizational goals for the year. And I want to highlight here that we really are talking about a continual process. This is cyclical in nature. There's not really just a beginning and end and then you're done. It is reoccurring. So you might set a goal, and then along the way you're tracking performance and you're talking about it, and you're coming back, and maybe you're redirecting, maybe you're resetting your goals, maybe you need to stretch more, or maybe you need to make some corrections if things have happened that you haven't anticipated. So all of this is to say that performance management isn't just evaluating someone and giving them a rating. It is really monitoring their performance, helping them identify ways to improve, and then giving them opportunities for development and continued progress and growth. So I want you to take a minute, and if we were in class, we would have this conversation, but we're not. So I want you to take a minute and think about performance management and how it might affect other areas of human resources and other development activities. So why is performance management so consequential? What other HR functions do you think it intersects with? And if you really want to keep thinking about it, you can pause here, but I'm going to go ahead and progress. And really to say that performance management intersects with almost every part of HR. So it certainly intersects with training. When we do performance management well, when we are effective in the ways in which we evaluate employees and coach and develop employees, it helps us identify what our training needs are in the organization. So if we're consistently, monitoring our employees and see that there's a gap in certain knowledge or abilities, that can help us identify where we need to keep training. So, with performance management, it's not just giving a rating, but really trying to home in on how our employees are performing and do they have the knowledge, skills, and abilities we need? Is the marketplace changing? Is our strategic direction changing? What do we need to do in order to stay current and stay competitive? Performance management is also quite helpful in bleeding into recruitment and hiring. So, when we effectively, efficiently evaluate, manage performance, it helps us create a talent inventory. So we can get a sense of who is our talent, who is our star talent, in what areas do we have, enough employees, in what areas might we be in trouble if we're having turnover, if we, again, are missing certain skills or abilities. Maybe they can't be trained, so we need to hire certain individuals in specific areas of the organization. And this could also help us identify our skills of the future. So as our organization changes, as technology advances, we might need to identify what new skills are required to continue to do the work. And then lastly, performance management is helpful for developing a compensation strategy and ensuring our employees are getting compensated commensurate with their performance. So there are links obviously between performance and rewards, and the ways in which we develop a compensation strategy can tie back to how we monitor performance and how we want to reward that performance. So all of this is to say is that performance management is essential. It provides a really good foundation for other functional areas of HR. And so it's important that we do it well, and it's important that we do it fairly. So, again, you can take a minute to think about how performance management might be affected by DEI issues. And if you've participated in any part of this class so far this semester, you'll know that there are a lot of ways that biases, stereotypes, prejudice, all of these can also be present in the performance management process. And that's really dangerous when they are because, again, we just talked about links between performance management and compensation and promotions and training and developmental opportunities. And whenever we have biases or prejudice against certain individuals or certain groups, it could impact the ways in which we decide to engage with them, mentor them, coach them, and rate them. And that, of course, then has implications for who we choose to be leaders and who moves up and who gets left behind, so to speak. So it's quite documented, quite well documented in the research literature that there is bias in performance ratings. And in fact, evidence has indicated that women and employees of color tend to receive lower ratings, but also less quality feedback compared to white male counterparts. So it's not just that the ratings lower, but then when it comes to providing developmental feedback and areas in which employees can improve, right? That feedback's really important for helping employees get ahead. Women, individuals of color aren't getting that same level of quality feedback. So what the research has tended to show by and large is that when we're evaluating white employees, those ratings of white employees tend to be similar, regardless of if it's a white or a black manager giving the evaluation. So white and black managers together give similar evaluations of white employees. But white managers give significantly lower ratings to black employees compared to black managers. So what that means is that when we have a black employee and they are being rated by a white or a black manager, the white manager tends to give lower ratings to that employee. And so this obviously is problematic because in that first bullet point there, it's showing that managers, white and black managers, can be aligned and that they tend to be aligned when they're evaluating white employees. They're giving very similar ratings. Yet when they're asked to rate a black employee, the black employee seems to be disadvantaged if the person rating them is white. We also know that men receive specific feedback tied to organizational outcomes, so that when it comes time to giving developmental feedback or explaining what needs to be done or where we go from here, men are getting that feedback that's needed. Whereas women tend to receive vague feedback, and it's often centered around communication or ways to improve communication. You can tie this back to stereotypes and gendered stereotypes and what we expect of women. Uh, and really the feedback they get is not tied to organizational outcomes. So you could see in that very definition of performance management, that's a critical piece that's missing here for women, and not allowing them necessarily to see how their work or any possible improvements might help support those organizational goals. So there's specific types of bias. We're going to cover 4 of them that tend to be there's lots of different forms of biases, but these 4 tend to be the most pertinent when it comes to performance management. And you'll see there's a citation there, Williams et al. This is a Harvard Business Review article. And as a fun fact, last time I taught this course, I taught it in person, and we had a guest speaker. We had Tara from Dick's Sporting Goods came in to talk to our class. And this is a pure coincidence, and it was almost serendipitous. Tara and Dick's Sporting Goods actually worked with Joan Williams, this HBR author, and they had their entire performance management system evaluated for bias, and they did more or less like a bias inventory. So Williams came in, evaluated Dick's Sporting Goods, assessed where they had some weaknesses in order to make the performance management process more fair. So Tara, when she came to the class, talked all about this. So if you have a chance to mingle with her at future practicums or networking sessions, I highly recommend it. But it was a coincidence because I actually assigned the Williams article to my students to read, and I didn't know the connection between that article and Dick's Sporting Goods. And then Tara came in and talked about it. It was just like such an amazing synergy between course content and real world application. So these biases do exist. Organizations are looking for them, and organizations can take steps to try to recognize and then mitigate those biases. So the first bias is the prove it again bias. And this is when individuals, tend to be minority individuals, are expected to demonstrate excellence and competence over and over. So if they do something great, like, okay, great, you did it this year, but can you keep the momentum and do it again next year? And so these individuals are not only expected to be great every single year, to demonstrate that they know how to do something every single year, but they're also more likely to have their mistakes mentioned in their evaluations. And so what's interesting in this prove it again is that white men tend to be evaluated on their potential and what they could contribute in the future, and if they're more or less a rising star or on the track, right? You're on the track to success. Whereas women and individuals of color tend to be evaluated on their performance. And so that is important, and that is what we should be evaluating, is performance. But that's not the standard we hold typically when we're evaluating white men, where we tend to be looking into their future. And so this creates different standards and different baselines of what it is that we're assessing. And of course, can lead to different outcomes for these groups of individuals. Typically why we tend to see a lot of white men in leadership positions compared to individuals of color, compared to women. The second bias is called the tightrope. And this is really where we expect women and individuals of color to really follow our expectations to a very close degree, that there's a very narrow range of behavior that we consider acceptable, and we don't want them stepping outside of those bounds at all. And when they do, we punish them for it. So Interestingly enough, when evaluations were reviewed for bias, the authors tended to find that individuals of color and women were more likely to have personality mentioned in their evaluation. And this is important because for women, we might say that somebody is, aggressive or not likable, or maybe they need to be more friendly. You can link this back to the case study we did with Wendy, right, in the Europa case study, that we tend to hone in on certain personality characteristics that we expect of women, but we don't necessarily use those same personality characteristics when we're evaluating men or white men. And so, interestingly, we see for Black men in their evaluations, 83% of Black men had that they had a good attitude, right? We expected them to have a certain kind of attitude. This was important for 83% of men. While this was only mentioned for 46% of white men. So we tend to pay attention more to the personality attributes, to the attitudes of minority individuals, and expecting those individuals to kind of fall in line with being a good player and having the right attitude, and it wasn't just about doing the work. The third bias is called the maternal wall. And this is when working mothers are perceived as being less committed and competent than non-mothers or male counterparts. So we often hear this called the motherhood penalty, that when women become moms, they're penalized by getting either less quality work or getting shifted to different responsibilities, different projects. On the other hand, just kind of as a fun fact, when men become fathers, there's actually tends to be this like fatherhood bump where they end up being seen as like more prestigious or ready to take on more. Oftentimes they get pay increases, and those aren't things that we associate with working moms. So there are a lot of gendered assumptions about what women can do and what they want, and so we assume if they become a mom, they want to just be a mom full time, and they might or they might not. And sometimes we don't sit down and have those conversations, those future career conversations, and where someone sees themselves and how they want to grow. We often see in evaluations, when evaluating or kind of reviewing the content of job evaluations, that women get more comments about being overworked, that we assume that they're taking on too many roles, whether they are or not. But that's language that we don't typically use when talking about men. And in this particular article, the Harvard Business Review article, Williams and her team were looking at law firms. They were looking at a particular law firm and evaluating bias in that law firm. And what they found is that in the evaluations of women, 20% of women had comments in their evaluations about not wanting to make partner, which may or may not be true. But they didn't have that same level for men. And so there's this idea that if a woman, if she's a mom, then she also has these other responsibilities and roles that she needs to fill, and therefore is less likely to be perceived as wanting to make partner, even if she might have career aspirations. And then the last one are racial stereotypes. And so these are expectations about what individuals can or should do based on their race. So, for instance, in their evaluation of organizations, Williams found that there was a tendency to mention that Asian individuals were good at technical skills, but not at leaderships, because there are stereotypes, right? Pervasive stereotypes about Asian individuals being good at STEM-based tasks, and not as good at communicating. And so we see those stereotypes pervading into the performance evaluations as well. So those are just 4 types of bias, but they tend to be the most problematic, and again, kind of follow this Harvard Business Review article. And so there are steps that we can take to improve performance evaluations themselves. So we can do 2 things. We can change the evaluation itself and the questions we're asking and the rating scales we're using. And then we can also give training to the raters and trying to minimize bias within the individuals who are doing the ratings. So this particular slide here, we're focused on just changing the evaluation itself. So, the first thing is that whenever we're going to create some kind of rating form or appraisal form, we need to identify and agree upon criteria in advance. So, we need to say very clearly what it is that we're assessing. We need to identify what the rating scale is and what it takes to get a 1 and what it takes to get a 5, but very clearly in advance, ensuring that everyone's using the same criteria to evaluate all employees. We can also use formal prompts throughout the evaluation to remind evaluators to be consistent and fair. So we can ask individuals, are you basing your ratings only on this particular individual? Are you considering the entire performance evaluation period and not just what happened in the last month or so? So using these prompts can remind evaluators to follow the rules and to stick to those guidelines and try to block out some of the noise that biases create. Uh, we can reduce open box evaluations and instead use rubrics. Any good researcher, any good HR practitioner will tell you that open box is a nightmare because you can get an unstandardized response. You don't know what's going to be said, and it's really hard to compare and contrast those evaluations. So rather than having just saying discuss performance and typing in a big paragraph about what someone did or didn't do, we should be using rubrics to guide individuals towards specific behaviors that we want to focus on. We can also ask for raters to provide evidence for each of the criteria that we're trying to investigate. So if we are examining someone's a level of, I don't know if we want to talk about their leadership ability, then we should ask somebody to provide 3 pieces of evidence to support their rating. We know that when individuals are expected and asked to expand upon their evaluations, that it helps them to calibrate their rating more than if we just ask them to give a number with no explanation. And then lastly, we can focus on individual performance. So the goal is not to compare employees to one another, but really to focus on one employee. Did that employee meet expectations? Were they engaging in the right behaviors? Were they producing the right results? So it doesn't matter what someone else was doing, even if someone's a rock star. We shouldn't be holding individuals to that standard, right? We need to hold them to the standards of the job that have been previously identified there in bullet point number 1. So all of these are ways that we can make the form, the evaluation itself more fair. We can also train evaluators. So we can make evaluators better raters. We can make them more fair. So the first would be to deliver unconscious bias training. You all have taken the IAT. There are other mechanisms or other types of unconscious bias training, but as we've mentioned, if we don't know about our biases, we can't do anything about them. But if we know about them, well, then we can take steps to ensure that they're not impacting our decision making. We can incorporate bias reduction trainings into other trainings. So we don't always have to say, hey, we're having an unconscious bias training. Sometimes that can be a turnoff, particularly in hostile organizational climates. So you really have to know the organization that you're working with and understand their culture and climate, but you can incorporate bias reduction training into anything. So anytime you have a training on something, you train on whatever that topic is, and then you can include a slide or 2 about bias and how to remove bias in that particular area on which you're training. We also need to train evaluators on how to use the performance evaluation form. And while that might seem silly, it's not. I mean, we're all in HR, so we know how to create a form and we know how to evaluate and follow the guidelines. But that's not a science for all individuals, particularly those that are going to be using the form. So they aren't trained in HR, they're trained in doing their job. And so it's our responsibility to teach them about how to use the form and what prompts they should be thinking about and reminding them to, follow all of the instructions, etc. We can also go back and review prior feedback or evaluations for bias. So we can look at what comments evaluators have made in the past and identify those that may be problematic, and let's talk through it and say, here's why that might be problematic and here's what we could say in the future. So going back and actually looking at prior ratings they've given and letting them know if they're acceptable or not. And then, of course, providing opportunities for interaction among dissimilar others. This even goes back to that head, heart, and hand model for reducing bias. So, the more we can get individuals to collaborate, to work together, to have opportunities to connect with one another, it's going to help lessen those biases if those interactions are productive and positive. So we can create opportunities within our organization for individuals to interact and network with one another, and simply by being able to engage with dissimilar others, it can help dispel some of those biases that we carry. So, as we mentioned at the beginning, performance management involves giving continuous feedback. So, feedback is not just once per year. Feedback shouldn't just be something that shows up on your performance evaluation. I mean, think about this from a semester kind of class standpoint. If you only got feedback at the very end of the semester, right? You got your grade at the end of the semester, and that's the only time you had gotten feedback. I think a lot of students will be pretty upset with that, right? You want to know along the way how you're doing. You turn in assignments, you want to know what I think about your performance on those assignments. And then you use that to help gauge, if you need to make improvements or if there's areas that need to, could be further developed, etc. So just thinking about, if I only got my grade at the end of the semester, that's the first time I got it. Well, now I don't have any opportunity for change, right? If I get an F and it's the end of the semester, there's nothing else I can do. I've missed any chances to improve. And that's more or less how we can think about giving feedback only once per year in an organization. It's harmful for employees because they're never given an opportunity to make improvements along the way. But oftentimes we see that managers are not giving the feedback that they need continuously. So it doesn't mean you always have to formally rate the performance, but you should be having some check-ins, semi-regular check-ins with each of your employees to see how things are going, to see if they're on track, etc. But from a DEI standpoint, what we tend to see is this idea of protective hesitation. And this occurs when we don't give feedback to someone because we worry about upsetting them. So if something is minor, we think, I'm not going to tell them about it because I don't want them to get all upset, or I don't want them to think I'm angry about it, whatever. But that's problematic because that person is missing out on a growth opportunity. We are not having a productive conversation about something they need to hear because we're worried about upsetting them. So if managers are afraid to give feedback to dissimilar others, those employees don't have the opportunity to improve or develop. So it almost holds them back because we're afraid to have the conversation. And what we know in classes, in the workplace, when there is no feedback given, employees are going to assume that they're doing a good job. So if we say nothing, employees will continue to do what they're doing because they will think that it's okay, that no one told them otherwise. They're going to keep doing what they're doing with the assumption that it's a good enough performance. So if we're seeing something that's occurring and we think it's problematic, we need to speak up and talk about it because we are not doing anyone a favor by withholding information they might need to continue to grow. So one thing that we need to consider is that when we're giving feedback to employees, we don't always have to give feedback on improvements. We can also give feedback on things that they're doing well. So I'm going to introduce two models to you here. This one's called the BET model, and then we're going to talk about the BEAR model here in a minute. But the BET model is a very simple kind of feedback tool that you can use to give feedback to others. So the B stands for behavior. So here you identify the behavior the individual is exhibiting that benefits the group. E is the effect. So you identify what the effect of that behavior is on our team's success. And then T is a simple thank you. So for instance, if you're participating in the discussion board, I could say, thank you so much for your thorough and meaningful responses to your classmates' discussion posts. You really helped move our discussion forward and helped it to be interesting and engaging this week. Thank you. That's a very kind of simplistic use of the BET model, but it works. I'm saying exactly what someone did, I'm saying what the effect was, and then obviously thank you, because it's good to just thank your employees or those around you. So this BET model is really helpful for giving feedback. We're linking what someone is doing with the outcome. So we're telling them why that behavior is important, not just that we liked what they did, but wow, here's how you supported the team, or here's how you influenced these important outcomes. But what we find in HR and in really all places of organizations is that it's really hard to give constructive feedback, that there's a variety of reasons why individuals are not good at it. So they don't want to hurt someone's feelings. They don't want it to be taken out of context. They are anxious, right? They're not confident in their own ability to deliver some of that feedback, etc. So we might not want a good employee to suddenly stop doing work well because we gave them feedback. So there's actually a lot of animosity, I think, a lot of anxiety around giving feedback, but it's such an important thing. We need feedback in order to help individuals grow and learn. So just like we had the BET model for giving positive feedback, we can use the BEAR model for giving constructive feedback. And it kind of follows that same pattern. So B is behavior. So the behavior that the person is exhibiting that's inhibiting the group or kind of holding things back, more or less the behavior that's ineffective and we want to stop. The E is the effect. So what is the effect of that behavior on the team's progress or on the success of our organization? A is alternative, a recommendation of the behavior the individual could or should do instead. And then R is the result. So what are the positive results that can occur if the individual makes the changes, or possible consequences if they do not? So in my class in the past, when I've been engaging with students, sometimes students will be on their cell phones a lot during class, and it's really a pet peeve of mine because you can't really do two things at once, and I really don't like the distraction. So I have in the past reached out to students to say, I'm reaching out to you because I noticed that the last few class sessions you've been on your phone during class. It distracts other people around you, it distracts me, and it keeps you from being engaged in the lecture and following along with what we're talking about. In the future, I'd recommend that you keep your cell phone on silent and put it away so that you're not tempted to use it. And by doing so, you'll not only learn more about the course, but you'll probably perform better on the assignments. And failing to, make these changes could result in deduction from your grade. So all of that there is kind of a run through of how you could use the BEAR model to try to address behavior that we'd like to see changed. So conflict and constructive feedback, it doesn't always have to be negative. It doesn't have to be full of animosity and emotion. It can be very simple, like this of just, I'm explaining to you what you're doing. I'm explaining why that behavior is problematic, what effect it's having, giving you an alternative, and then telling you what's going to happen if you do or don't change. So you can use this model on your employees. You can use this model on your significant other. You can use this model on your roommate. It's really a helpful tool because it takes out some of the emotion and it helps people understand why we think a behavior is or isn't problematic. And it provides a formula so that everyone's getting the same kind of feedback. You're not overindulging. And just as a fun fact here, when I was in my early 20s and I was still in college, I worked as a manager at a boutique hotel in a college town, and I kind of ended up in this managerial spot. I definitely wasn't ready. I thought at the time it was a great opportunity, but I was not ready. And now I know so much more. I wish I could go back in time and tell my old self all the mistakes I was making. But one time I had to fire an employee, and I liked this employee and I didn't want to hurt her feelings. And it took me probably an hour or 2 hours to fire the employee. Like, I just struggled so much with saying what I needed to say and just being definitive, kept dragging it out. And oh my gosh, it was a nightmare. And so using something like this, the BEAR model, can really help you identify what needs to be said so you don't do what I did and go way off track and try to fill in your gaps. And sometimes you say one thing and it ends up kind of overtaking the feedback you're given, and they leave saying, what was the point of that at all? So this not only tells you kind of what to say, but it standardizes it so that everyone's getting feedback in a similar way. And that way you can reduce biases of who might get more or less feedback. Okay, so that takes us to the end of the slideshow for this week. I will go ahead and upload this for you all, and I'm just looking forward to engaging with you this coming week. I really love this content. I think it's super interesting, and I hope you all are enjoying it as well. But if you have any questions at all, of course, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. So have a great week, have a productive week, go out and enjoy the sunshine and get some vitamin D, and then come back and do your readings and come back and be ready to engage. Have a wonderful week ahead. Take care, all.